In the grand halls of Thornfield Grange, a priceless sapphire brooch vanishes, sparking whispers of blackmail and betrayal. When a guest is found stabbed by a fountain, the secrets of the Ashford family unravel. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose sharp mind and quiet observation peel back layers of lies, blue threads, bent hairpins, and cryptic notes revealing a scandal from the past that drives a killer to strike. Will she untangle the web of greed and vengeance before another life is lost? Chapter 1. The invitation to Thornfield Grange. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over the village of St. Mary Mead, where the air was thick with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. In her modest cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she surveyed the quiet street. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, noted the postman's bicycle wobbling slightly as he pedaled past, a letter clutched in his hand. It was addressed to her, she knew, for she had been expecting it. The letter, when it arrived, was written in an elegant, looping hand on thick cream paper, sealed with a wax crest. It bore the name of Lady Beatrice Ashford, mistress of Thornfield Grange, a sprawling estate some 30 miles from St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple slit the envelope with a silver letter opener and read the contents with her usual calm attention. My dear Miss Marple, it has been too long since we last met at the Women's Institute luncheon. I write to invite you to Thornfield Grange for a small gathering this weekend. My nephew, Charles Ashford, has returned from his travels, and we are to celebrate his engagement to Miss Clara Vernon, a charming young lady. A few friends and family will join us. Nothing grand, merely a quiet affair. Yet I confess, dear Jane, that your presence would bring me great comfort. There are matters here, subtle but troubling, that I believe your keen insight might illuminate. Do come. I shall send a car for you on Friday at 3 o'clock. Yours sincerely, Beatrice Ashford. Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully. Lady Beatrice was not a woman given to vague anxieties. Her request hinted at something more than a social call. Miss Marple's mind, ever alert to the undercurrents of human behavior, recalled the Ashford family's history, old money, old secrets, and a tendency toward pride that often bordered on arrogance. She set her knitting aside and rose to prepare her small suitcase. Her curiosity piqued. The car arrived promptly at 3 on Friday, a sleek black Rolls-Royce driven by a taciturn chauffeur. Named Hodges, the journey to Thornfield Grange wound through rolling hills and past hedgerows heavy with blackberries. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in the back, observed the landscape with her usual quiet attention, noting the way the light fell on the distant spire of Thornfield's private chapel. The Grange itself was a handsome Georgian pile, its red brick facade softened by ivy and flanked by manicured lawns. As the car crunched along the gravel drive, Miss Marple's eyes took in the scene, the tall windows glinting in the afternoon sun, the gardeners trimming the topiary with meticulous care, and, at the top of the stone steps, Lady Beatrice herself, a tall woman of 60 with silver hair and an air of restrained elegance. Jane, my dear. Lady Beatrice descended the steps, her smile warm, but her eyes shadowed. How good of you to come. I could hardly refuse such a kind invitation, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but her gaze sharp. She allowed herself to be led into the grand hall, where a chandelier sparkled above a marble floor. The air smelled of beeswax and old roses, and the walls were lined with portraits of Ashfords long gone. The other guests were already assembled in the drawing room, a spacious chamber with heavy drapes and a roaring fire. Lady Beatrice made the introductions with practiced grace. There was Charles Ashford, a handsome man in his early 30s, with dark hair and a restless energy that Miss Marple noted at once. Beside him stood Clara Vernon, his fiancée, a striking young woman with auburn hair and a smile that seemed to flicker like a candle in a draught. Next was Dr. Harold Grayson, the family physician, a stout man with a booming laugh and a habit of polishing his spectacles. Then came Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer, Lady Beatrice's widowed cousin, whose pinched expression suggested a life of small resentments. Her son, Lionel Mortimer, a lanky young man with a sullen air, lounged by the window, flicking ash from a cigarette into a silver tray. Finally, there was Miss Sylvia Gray, a governess-stern companion to Lady Beatrice, whose quiet demeanor and downcast eyes suggested a woman accustomed to observing, rather than speaking. Tea was served, and the conversation flowed easily enough. Talk of the weather, the harvest, and Charles's recent travels to India. Yet Miss Marple, sipping her Earl Grey, sensed an undercurrent of tension. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she passed the sugar bowl. Lionel's gaze darted toward his mother with something like resentment, and Lady Beatrice, though gracious, seemed to watch her guests with an intensity that belied her polite small talk. "You must tell me, Charles," Miss Marple said, her tone light, "what treasures you brought back from India. I hear the markets there are quite extraordinary." Charles laughed, a touch too loudly. "Oh, a few trinkets, Miss Marple. Nothing to rival the family jewels here at Thornfield." He gestured vaguely toward a glass cabinet in the corner, where a collection of glittering heirlooms was displayed, including a sapphire brooch that caught the light with a cold fire. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the brooch. "How beautiful," she murmured. "A family piece, I presume." "Indeed," Lady Beatrice said quickly. "It belonged to my grandmother, a memento of happier times." Her voice held a note of strain, and Miss Marple filed the observation away. As the afternoon wore on, the guests dispersed to their rooms to dress for dinner. Miss Marple, guided by a maid to a cozy bedroom overlooking the rose garden, unpacked her things with care. She placed her knitting on the bedside table and stood by the window, her mind turning over the scene she had just witnessed. Something was amiss at Thornfield Grange, something that lay beneath the polished surface of this gathering. She thought of Lady Beatrice's letter, its hint of unease, and of the sapphire brooch, which seemed to carry a weight beyond its beauty. Dinner that evening was a formal affair, served in a dining room lit by candelabra. The conversation was lively, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to small details, the way Clara's fingers tightened around her wine glass when Charles spoke of his travels, the glance Mrs. Mortimer shot at Lady Beatrice when the subject of inheritance rose, the way Dr. Grayson's joviality seemed to falter when Lionel mentioned a recent illness in the family. As the meal drew to a close, Lady Beatrice rose, her face pale. "I have something to show you all," she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. She led the party to the drawing room, where the glass cabinet stood open. The sapphire brooch was gone. A murmur ran through the group. Charles swore under his breath. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Lionel's eyes narrowed, and Mrs. Mortimer let out a small, theatrical gasp. Dr. Grayson frowned, polishing his spectacles furiously. Only Miss Sylvia Gray remained silent, her face unreadable. "It was here this afternoon," Lady Beatrice said, her voice tight. "I checked it myself. Someone in this house has taken it." Miss Marple, standing quietly by the fireplace, observed the reactions of each guest. The loss of the brooch was no mere theft, she sensed. It was a spark that might ignite something far more dangerous. Her little gray cells, as she liked to call them, were already at work, piecing together the fragments of what she had seen and heard. "Perhaps," she said softly, her eyes twinkling with quiet resolve, "we shall find that this memento has more to tell us than we yet realize." Chapter 2. The shadow of the Crimith drawing room at Thornfield Grange was heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the faint tick of the ormolu clock on the mantel. The empty space in the glass cabinet where the sapphire brooch had rested seemed to draw every eye, a mute accusation in the flickering candlelight. Lady Beatrice Ashford stood by the cabinet, her hands clasped tightly, her face a mask of controlled distress. The guests, scattered about the room, wore expressions ranging from shock to suspicion, and Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the hearth, observed them all with her quiet, bird-like attentiveness. "It is unthinkable, Lady Beatrice said at last, her voice low but firm. "That brooch has been in our family for generations. It is not merely valuable, it is irreplaceable. I must insist that no one leaves this house until it is found." Charles Ashford, pacing by the window, stopped abruptly. "At Beatrice, surely you're not suggesting one of us took it?" His tone was indignant, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward his fiancée, Clara Vernon. who sat rigid on a velvet settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I suggest nothing, Lady Beatrice replied. I state only what is evident. The brooch was here at tea. It is gone now. We are all present, and no one else has entered the house. Dr. Harold Grayson cleared his throat, his jovial demeanor strained. Perhaps it was misplaced. A servant, perhaps tidying up. He polished his spectacles with a handkerchief, a gesture Miss Marple had already marked as a nervous habit. The servants have been with me for years, Lady Beatrice said sharply. I trust them implicitly. Besides, the cabinet was locked, and I hold the only key. She produced a small silver key from her pocket, holding it up for all to see. Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer, perched on a chair near the door, gave a small, disdainful sniff. Well, it's clear enough what's happened. Someone saw an opportunity and took it. People will do anything for money these days. Her eyes darted toward Clara, who flushed but said nothing. Lionel Mortimer, leaning against the wall with a cigarette dangling from his fingers, let out a short laugh. Oh, come now, Mother. Let's not start pointing fingers. For all we know, the things slipped behind a cushion. Miss Sylvia Gray, the quiet companion, spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear. The cabinet is too high for anything to slip behind, and the brooch was pinned to a velvet stand. It could not have fallen. Her observation, delivered without flourish, drew a sharp glance from Lionel, who flicked ash into the tray with unnecessary force. Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting needles pausing in her hands. A most curious situation, she said mildly. A locked cabinet, a single key, and yet the brooch is gone. It reminds me of a little incident in St. Mary Mead. When Mrs. Clement's pearl earrings vanished from a locked box, it turned out, you see, that the box had been tampered with in a most ingenious way. The room turned to her, some with curiosity, others with impatience. Charles frowned. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple, that someone picked the lock. I suggest nothing, Mr. Ashford, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. I merely observe that things are not always as they seem. A locked door, for instance, may not be locked at all if one knows how to turn the key. Lady Beatrice's lips tightened. I checked the lock myself this afternoon. It was secure. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, but perhaps we might examine the cabinet now. A fresh pair of eyes can sometimes see what others miss. With a nod, Lady Beatrice led the group to the cabinet. Miss Marple, rising with surprising agility for her age, approached the glass case and peered at it closely. The lock was small but sturdy, a brass mechanism that showed no signs of tampering. The velvet stand where the brooch had rested was slightly askew, as if it had been moved in haste. Miss Marple's fingers, light as a feather, traced the edge of the cabinet, noting a faint scratch on the glass near the lock. Interesting, she murmured, almost to herself. And when did you last see the brooch, Lady Beatrice? Precisely, if you please. At 4 o'clock. Just before tea, Lady Beatrice replied. I opened the cabinet to show Clara the family jewels. She admired the brooch particularly, Clara's head jerked up, her cheeks paling. I did admire it, she stammered. It's beautiful. But I didn't touch it. No one is accusing you, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, though her eyes lingered on Clara's trembling hands. But it is helpful to know who was near the cabinet and when. I was in the library after tea, Charles said quickly, working on some letters. Clara was with me. Not the whole time, Lionel interjected, his voice edged with malice. I saw you in the hall, Clara, round 5. You were near the drawing room. Clara's eyes widened. I was fetching a shawl from my room. I didn't go near the cabinet. Enough, Lady Beatrice said, raising a hand. This is getting us nowhere. I shall call the police in the morning if the brooch is not found. For now, let us retire. It has been a trying evening. The guests murmured their agreement, though the air was thick with suspicion. As they dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the cabinet, her eyes scanning the room. She noted the position of the windows, all closed and latched, and the heavy drapes that would have concealed any movement from outside. The clock on the mantel read 9:30. As she made her way to her room, Miss Marple passed the library, where a light still burned. Peering through the half-open door, she saw Charles and Clara in hushed conversation. Their faces tense. Charles's hand gripped Clara's arm, and her expression was one of distress. Miss Marple did not linger, but filed the scene away in her mind, alongside the scratch on the glass, the askew velvet stand, and the silver key in Lady Beatrice's hand in her bedroom. Miss Marple sat at the small writing desk, her knitting untouched. She drew a piece of paper from her bag and began to jot down notes in her neat, precise hand. 4:00 p.m. Lady Beatrice shows brooch to Clara. Cabinet locked. 5 p.m. Clara seen near drawing room by Lionel. 9:30 p.m. Brooch discovered missing. Cabinet shows faint scratch. Suspects: Charles restless, protective of Clara, Clara nervous. Near cabinet, Lionel sullen, quick to accuse, Mrs. Mortimer resentful. Vague hostility, Dr. Grayson nervous habit, evasive, Miss Gray observant. Reserved you she paused, her pen hovering over the paper. The theft of the brooch, she sensed, was not the heart of the matter. It was a symptom, a thread in a larger tapestry of secrets woven through Thornfield Grange. In her experience, such threads often led to darker truths that might involve not just theft, but something far graver. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to St. Mary Mead and the case of the pearl earrings. The thief, it turned out, had been motivated not by greed, but by desperation, a need to conceal a deeper crime. She wondered if Thornfield Grange held a similar secret, waiting to be unraveled by her little gray cells. Chapter 3. The arrival of suspicion. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Thornfield Grange, casting long shadows across the breakfast room. The table was set with fine china and silver, but the atmosphere was far from convivial. The guests, assembled for breakfast, sat in uneasy silence, their faces reflecting the strain of the previous evening's discovery. The missing sapphire brooch hung over them like a specter, and Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end of the table with a cup of tea, observed the group with her usual quiet scrutiny. Lady Beatrice, at the head of the table, was pale but composed, her hands steady as she poured coffee. Charles Ashford buttered his toast with unnecessary vigor, his jaw tight. Clara Vernon, beside him, picked at her scrambled eggs, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. Dr. Harold Grayson, attempting to lighten the mood, made a jovial remark about the weather, but it fell flat. Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer sat with a pinched expression. Her son Lionel slouched beside her, his cigarette unlit, but twirling between his fingers. Miss Sylvia Gray, as ever, was silent, her gaze fixed on her plate, though Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened around her fork when Charles spoke. The meal was interrupted by the arrival of a stranger. Hodges, the chauffeur, entered the room and announced in his gruff voice, "Miss Marple, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says he's an old acquaintance." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, but she rose with her customary calm. "Thank you, Hodges. Please show him to the morning room. I shall join him shortly." As she excused herself, the other guests exchanged glances. Charles muttered something to Clara, who nodded faintly. Mrs. Mortimer's lips pursed, and Lionel lit his cigarette with a deliberate flick of his lighter. Miss Marple, noting all this, made her way to the morning room, a bright space with tall windows overlooking the rose garden. Waiting there was Inspector Japp, a sturdy man with a bristling mustache and an air of brisk efficiency. His face broke into a familiar smile as Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple, I heard you were here and couldn't resist stopping by. Though I'll wager this isn't just a social visit, eh, Inspector Japp?" Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "How delightful to see you. And you are quite right, this is no ordinary weekend. Lady Beatrice has lost a valuable brooch, and the circumstances are most intriguing." Japp's smile faded. "A theft, is it? Well, I'm here on other business, but I'll lend a hand if you like. I was passing through to investigate a report of stolen goods in the area, jewelry, mostly. Thought I'd check if anything's amiss at the Grange." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Stolen jewelry, you say? How curious. The brooch in question is a sapphire, a family heirloom. It vanished from a locked cabinet last night, between 4 and 9:30. Japp whistled softly. "Locked, eh? That's a tidy little puzzle. Who's in the house?" Miss Marple recounted the cast of characters. Lady Beatrice, Charles and Clara, Dr. Grayson, Mrs. Mortimer, Lionel, and Miss Gray. She mentioned the faint scratch on the cabinet, the silver key, and the alibis or lack thereof for the critical hours. Jap listened intently, jotting notes in a small black book. Sounds like a nest of vipers, he said when she finished. I'll have a word with Lady Beatrice, if she'll allow it. But I know you, Miss Marple, you've already got half the puzzle solved in that head of yours. Miss Marple smiled modestly. I merely observe, Inspector. People are so very revealing, if one knows where to look. Jap agreed to stay for the morning, and Lady Beatrice, when informed, consented to his presence, though her expression suggested she found the intrusion distasteful. The guests were summoned to the drawing room, where Jap, with his characteristic bluntness, began his inquiries. Now then, he said, standing before the fireplace, I'm not here to accuse anyone, but a valuable item's gone missing, and I need to know where everyone was between 4 and 9:30 last night. Let's start with you, Mr. Ashford. Charles straightened, his tone defensive. I told you. I was in the library, writing letters. Clara was with me most of the time. Most of the time? Jap pressed, his eyes narrowing. Clara flushed. I stepped out to fetch a shawl from my room around 5. I wasn't gone long, 10 minutes, perhaps. Lionel smirked. Long enough to pass by the drawing room, though. That's enough, Lionel, Charles snapped. She didn't take the blasted brooch. Mrs. Mortimer interjected, her voice sharp. Really, Charles, there's no need for rudeness. I was in my room, resting, from 4 until dinner. Lionel can confirm it. Lionel shrugged. I was in the billiard room, knocking balls about. Didn't see Mother, but I didn't see anyone else either. Dr. Grayson coughed. I was in the conservatory, tending to some orchids I'd brought for Lady Beatrice, alone. I'm afraid. Miss Sylvia Gray spoke softly. I was in the library reading until about 6. Then I went to my room to dress for dinner. Jap scribbled in his notebook, his expression unreadable. And you, Lady Beatrice? I was in my study until 6, then with the guests before dinner, she said. I checked the cabinet at 4, as I told Miss Marple. It was locked, and the brooch was there. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, listened with rapt attention. The alibis were vague, overlapping in ways that made verification difficult. She noted the way Charles's hand rested protectively on Clara's shoulder, the faint tremor in Dr. Grayson's voice, and the way Miss Gray's eyes flicked toward Lionel when he mentioned the billiard room. Jap turned to the cabinet, examining it as Miss Marple had done. The scratch here, he said, pointing to the faint mark near the lock. Could be nothing, but it's odd. Anyone know how it got there? A chorus of denials followed. Miss Marple, however, spoke up. It is curious, Inspector, that the scratch is so precise, almost as if it were made deliberately. To draw attention, Jap shot her a glance. You think it's a plant? I think, Miss Marple said, that we must consider every possibility. In St. Mary Mead, there was a case where a broken window was blamed for a theft, but the glass was broken from the inside. Things are not always what they seem. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Jap nodded. Right? I'll have a constable come by later to dust for prints. In the meantime, no one leaves the estate. Understood. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the cabinet. She approached it once more, her fingers brushing the velvet stand. It was still askew, and she noticed something new, a tiny thread, pale blue, caught in the hinge of the cabinet door. She plucked it carefully and tucked it into her handkerchief, her mind turning over its significance. Returning to her room, she added to her notes, 9 a.m. Inspector Jap arrives. Alibis given, all vague. Scratch on cabinet noted by Jap, new clue, blue thread in cabinet hinge. Whose clothing matches? Observations, Charles protective, Clara nervous, Lionel evasive. Mrs. Mortimer hostile, Dr. Grayson uneasy, Miss Gray watchful. Miss Marple sat back, her little gray cells humming. The theft was a puzzle, but she sensed it was merely the prelude to something darker. The blue thread, the scratch, the strained glances among the guests all pointed to a deeper truth, one that Thornfield Grange was reluctant to reveal. She thought of Lady Beatrice's letter, its hint of unease, and wondered what had prompted her to call for help. Whatever it was, Miss Marple was certain it was more than a stolen brooch. Chapter 4. The question's deepened morning at Thornfield Grange unfolded with a deceptive calm, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows belying the tension that gripped the household. Miss Jane Marple, having finished her modest breakfast, retired to the morning room with a cup of tea and her knitting, her eyes bright with the quiet intensity of observation. The blue thread she had found in the cabinet hinge rested safely in her handkerchief, a small but tantalizing clue that her mind returned to again and again. She was not alone for long, however, as Inspector Japp joined her, his notebook in hand and his mustache bristling with purpose. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair opposite her, "this is a pretty mess. A locked cabinet, a missing brooch, and a house full of people who can't quite account for themselves. What's your take on it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "It is a puzzle, Inspector. But puzzles have a way of revealing themselves when one looks closely at the pieces. The thread I found, for instance, pale blue, silk, I believe. It suggests someone was near the cabinet, perhaps closer than they admit." Japp's eyes narrowed. "You think it's from clothing? Could be one of the ladies' dresses, or a gentleman's tie," Miss Marple said mildly. "In St. Mary Mead, a similar thread led to the unraveling of a most surprising affair. A young man's scarf, caught in a gate, betrayed his presence where he claimed not to have been." Japp chuckled. "You and your St. Mary Mead stories. I'll have the thread checked, but we'll need more than that to pin this down. I've sent for a constable to dust the cabinet for prints. Should be here by noon." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already elsewhere. She had observed the guests at breakfast, noting their attire. Clara Vernon had worn a green dress, Lady Beatrice a gray suit, and Mrs. Mortimer a severe black ensemble. Miss Sylvia Gray, however, had been in a pale blue blouse, and Dr. Grayson's tie, she recalled, was a similar shade. Lionel's clothing had been too dark to match, but Charles's waistcoat had a faint blue stripe. The thread was a clue, but it was not yet conclusive. The morning room door opened, and Lady Beatrice entered, her face drawn. "Miss Marple, Inspector, I must speak with you both. There has been a development." Japp leaned forward. "Another theft?" "No," Lady Beatrice said, her voice low. "Something worse. I received this just now." She produced a folded note, its edges crumpled as if gripped tightly. She handed it to Japp, who read it aloud. "Return the brooch by midnight, or the truth about the Ashford legacy will be revealed. You know what I mean." The note was written in a hurried, uneven hand, the ink smudged in places. Miss Marple, peering over Japp's shoulder, noted the paper a plain sheet, likely torn from a notepad in the house. "Where was this found?" Japp asked. "Slipped under my bedroom door," Lady Beatrice replied. "I found it this morning, just after breakfast." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And you have no idea who left it?" "None," Lady Beatrice said, though her gaze flickered briefly toward the door. "But it confirms my fears. The brooch's theft is not a simple act of greed. There is malice behind it, and perhaps something more." Japp folded the note carefully. "This changes things. We're not just dealing with a thief, we've got a blackmailer. I'll need to question everyone again, and I want to see where they were this morning." Miss Marple, her needles pausing, spoke softly. "It is curious, is it not, that the note mentions the Ashford legacy? It suggests knowledge of a family secret. Lady Beatrice, forgive me, but is there something about the brooch or your family that we should know?" Lady Beatrice stiffened, her hands clasping tightly. "The brooch is valuable, yes, but it is merely a symbol of our heritage. As for secrets, every family has its share, but I assure you, they are irrelevant to this matter." Miss Marple smiled gently, though her mind noted the evasion. "Of course, but secrets, like threads, have a way of catching where they are least expected." Japp, sensing the tension, stood right. "I'll start with the guests. Miss Marple, care to join me? Your knack for spotting what's off might come in handy." Miss Marple agreed, and they began their interviews in the library, a wood-paneled room lined with leather-bound books. First was Charles Ashford, who entered with a scowl, his hands thrust into his pockets. "I don't see why we're being hounded like criminals," he said. I was in my room this morning, shaving and dressing. Clara was with me until about 8. Then she went for a walk in the garden. And you saw no one near Lady Beatrice's room? Jap asked. No one, Charles said firmly. I was nowhere near her door. Miss Marple tilted her head. You mentioned Clara was in the garden. Did she mention seeing anyone else? Charles hesitated, his eyes flickering. She said she saw Lionel smoking by the fountain. That's all. Clara was next, her auburn hair slightly disheveled as if she had been running her hands through it. I was in the garden, yes, she confirmed. I needed air. This whole business with the Bruchets upsetting. I saw Lionel, as Charles said. And Dr. Grayson was in the conservatory. And you wrote no notes? Jap asked bluntly. Clara's eyes widened. A note? No, of course not. Why would I? Miss Marple observed the girl's flushed cheeks, her quick breathing. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. It was too soon to tell. Dr. Grayson followed, his spectacles gleaming as he polished them nervously. I was in the conservatory until 9, tending to my orchids. I saw Clara in the garden, but no one else. As for this note, I know nothing about it. Mrs. Mortimer and Lionel were interviewed together, at her insistence. I was in my room. Chapter 5. The Red Herring's Library at Thornfield Grange, with its heavy oak shelves and the faint scent of old leather, was a fitting stage for the unfolding drama. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm, while Inspector Japp continued his interviews. The blackmail note, with its ominous reference to the Ashford legacy, had cast a new shadow over the theft of the sapphire brooch, and Miss Marple's sharp mind was already sifting through the implications. The morning's inquiries had yielded little clarity, but the air was thick with suspicion, and she sensed that the truth was beginning to stir beneath the surface. Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer and her son Lionel were still before Jap, their postures rigid with mutual resentment. Mrs. Mortimer's voice was sharp as she answered. I was in my room all morning, Inspector, as I said. I had a headache and was resting. Lionel was with me until he went out to smoke. Lionel flicked a glance at his mother, his lips curling slightly. That's right. I was by the fountain. Around 8:30, saw Clara wandering about, looking like she'd lost something herself. Didn't see anyone near Aunt Beatrice's room, though. Jap's eyes narrowed. And this note, any idea who might have written it? Mrs. Mortimer sniffed. It's obvious, isn't it? Someone with a grudge against Beatrice. She's not as saintly as she seems. You know, old families like the Ashfords always have skeletons in their closets. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes lifting to meet Mrs. Mortimer's. A most interesting observation, Mrs. Mortimer. And what skeletons might those be? Mrs. Mortimer flushed, her hands tightening on her handbag. I meant nothing specific, Miss Marple. Only that wealth and status breed envy. Anyone could have written that note to frighten her. Lionel smirked, lighting another cigarette. Maybe it's just a prank, someone's idea of a joke. Miss Marple noted the casual tone, but also the way Lionel's fingers trembled slightly as he struck the match. A prank, she thought, or a deliberate attempt to muddy the waters. Miss Sylvia Gray was the last to be questioned, her quiet presence almost overlooked amid the louder personalities. She sat with her hands folded, her pale blue blouse catching Miss Marple's eye. I was in my room this morning, writing letters, she said softly. I saw no one near Lady Beatrice's door, and I know nothing of any note. Jap scribbled in his notebook, his frustration evident, right? So we've got a house full of people who saw nothing, heard nothing, and know nothing. Convenient. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not entirely, Inspector. People always reveal more than they intend. It is a matter of listening to what is not said. As the interviews concluded, Jap announced that the constable would arrive shortly to dust the cabinet for fingerprints. The guests dispersed, their unease palpable. Miss Marple, however, lingered in the library, her eyes drawn to a small writing desk in the corner. She approached it, noting a stack of plain notepaper identical to that used for the blackmail note. A fountain pen lay beside it, its nib stained with fresh ink. She made a mental note, then returned to her knitting, her mind turning over the morning's revelations. The constable arrived at noon, a young man named Perkins, who set to work dusting the cabinet with a brisk efficiency. Japp stood by, watching closely, while Miss Marple observed from a distance. The results were disappointing. The cabinet bore only Lady Beatrice's fingerprints, and a few smudged prints that could belong to anyone. The blackmail note, too, was clean, suggesting the writer had been careful. Looks like our thieves. No amateur, Japp muttered. War gloves, likely. Miss Marple nodded. Her thoughts on the blue thread. Or perhaps, Inspector. The thief wished us to believe they were so careful. Sometimes, the absence of evidence is itself a clue. Japp raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning instead to question the servants, Hodges, the chauffeur, and the maids. All confirmed they had been busy with their duties and had seen nothing unusual. Miss Marple, however, noted that Hodges avoided meeting her eyes, his gruff manner more guarded than before. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Charles and Clara kept to themselves, whispering in the garden, while Lionel lounged in the billiard room, his cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. Mrs. Mortimer retired to her room, complaining of another headache, and Dr. Grayson busied himself in the conservatory, though Miss Marple noticed he spent more time glancing out the window than tending his orchids. Miss Sylvia Gray, ever unobtrusive, was seen slipping into the library, a book in hand. Miss Marple decided to take a walk in the garden, her keen eyes scanning the grounds. The fountain where Lionel had been smoking was near the drawing room. Windows, she noted, offering a clear view of the cabinet. She paused by a rosebush, her fingers brushing the petals as she recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen necklace had been hidden in a flower bed. She bent down, ostensibly to admire the blooms, but her eyes searched the soil. Nothing. Returning to the house, she encountered Lady Beatrice in the hall, her face pale. Miss Marple, she said quietly, I fear this business with the brooch is only the beginning. That note, it speaks of things I cannot bear to think of. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Lady Beatrice, if there is something you know something about the brooch or the legacy it represents, it would be best to share it. Secrets, left buried, have a way of surfacing at the worst moments. Lady Beatrice hesitated, then shook her head. There's nothing, Jane, only old family stories, nothing more. Miss Marple did not press, but her mind filed away the moment. She returned to her room and added to her notes, 12 p.m. Constable Perkins finds only Lady Beatrice's fingerprints on cabinet. Note is clean. New clue. Notepaper in library matches blackmail note. Fountain pen recently used. Observations. Mrs. Mortimer hints at family secrets. Lionel's trembling hands. Hodges evasive. Sylvia in blue blouse. Charles and Clara secretive. As she set her pen down, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the blackmail note. Its vague threat suggested knowledge of something specific, something tied to the Ashford family. The brooch, she suspected, was not the true prize. It was a symbol, a key to something deeper. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a theft that masked a far graver crime, and she wondered if Thornfield Grange held a similar truth. The day drew to a close with no sign of the brooch, and the guests gathered for dinner in a strained silence. Miss Marple, watching from her place at the table, noted the way Clara avoided Lionel's gaze, the way Dr. Grayson's laugh rang hollow, and the way Lady Beatrice's hand lingered on the silver key she wore on a chain around her neck. The red herrings were multiplying, but Miss Marple's little gray cells were patient. The truth, she knew, would reveal itself in time, like a pattern emerging from a tangled skein of wool. Chapter 6. A clue in detail. Evening at Thornfield Grange descended with a chill that seemed to seep into the very walls, as if the house itself sensed the gathering storm. Dinner had been a tense affair, the clink of silverware and strained pleasantries barely masking the undercurrent of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the dining table, had observed the guests with her usual quiet acuity, noting the small gestures that spoke louder than words. Clara Vernon's nervous glance at Charles Ashford, Lionel Mortimer's sardonic smirk, and the way Dr. Harold Grayson's fingers fumbled with his napkin when Lady Beatrice mentioned the missing brooch. After dinner, the party retired to the drawing room, where a fire roared in a vain attempt to warm the atmosphere. Inspector Japp had departed to confer with the local police, promising to return the next morning. Leaving Miss Marple to continue her observations alone, she sat in her accustomed corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes moving. From one guest to another, the blackmail note, with its cryptic thread about the Ashford legacy, had deepened the mystery, and she sensed that the theft of the sapphire brooch was merely the surface of a far darker truth. As the guests sipped coffee, Lady Beatrice rose, her face pale but resolute. "I cannot allow this matter to disrupt our gathering further," she said. "Tomorrow, I shall search every room, with or without your consent. The brooch must be found." Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer gave a sharp laugh. "Search our rooms, really? Beatrice, this is too much. You'll accuse us all of being common thieves next." "It's not an accusation," Charles interjected, his voice tight. "It's a necessity. Someone here knows more than they're saying." Clara, sitting beside him, touched his arm. "Charles, please. This is upsetting enough without arguments." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Clara's hand. Noting a faint tremor, she recalled the blue thread found in the cabinet hinge and wondered again about Clara's green dress and Sylvia Gray's pale blue blouse. The thread was a small clue, but in Miss Marple's experience, small clues often led to great revelations. The conversation turned to other matters, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a sudden movement by the window. Miss Sylvia Gray, who had been standing quietly, dropped her coffee cup, the porcelain shattering on the hardwood floor. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Sylvia stammered, her face flushing. "It slipped from my hand." Dr. Grayson was quick to assist, fetching a cloth from a side table. "No harm done," he said jovially, though his eyes darted towards Sylvia with a curious intensity. Miss Marple, however, noted something else as Sylvia bent to retrieve the fragments. A small object fell from her pocket, a silver hairpin, its tip bent slightly, as if it had been used for something other than securing hair. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. "Allow me to help, Miss Gray," she said, kneeling beside the young woman. As she picked up a shard of porcelain, her fingers deftly retrieved the hairpin, tucking it into her sleeve unnoticed. Sylvia, flustered, thanked her and retreated to a chair, her hands clasped tightly. The incident passed without further comment, but Miss Marple's mind was alight. The hairpin, with its bent tip, was an anomaly. She thought of the scratch on the cabinet's glass, so precise and deliberate. Could the hairpin have made such a mark? It was a possibility, though not yet a certainty. As the guests began to retire for the night, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her eyes scanning the scene. The cabinet stood in its corner, its empty velvet stand a silent accusation. She approached it once more, her fingers brushing the glass where the scratch lay. The mark was shallow but distinct, and she imagined a hairpin wielded with care, creating it as a distraction or perhaps as a mistake. In her room, Miss Marple sat at the writing desk, her notes growing ever more detailed. 9 p.m. Sylvia Gray drops coffee cup. Hairpin falls from pocket. Tip bent, possibly used to scratch cabinet. Observations. Sylvia flustered, avoids eye contact. Clara's tremor persists. Dr. Grayson overly attentive to Sylvia. Lady Beatrice defensive about legacy. Theory. The scratch may be a red herring, meant to suggest tampering. The hairpin suggests Sylvia's involvement. But why? She examined the hairpin under the light of her bedside lamp. It was a simple design, unremarkable save for the bent tip, which bore a faint trace of something metallic, brass, perhaps, from the cabinet's lock. Miss Marple tucked the hairpin into her handkerchief alongside the blue thread, her mind turning over the implications. In St. Mary Mead, a bent hairpin had once been the key to a locked drawer, revealing a hidden will. Here, she suspected, the hairpin might unlock something far more sinister. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the blackmail note. Its mention of the Ashford legacy suggested a secret worth hiding, and she wondered if Sylvia, with her quiet watchfulness, knew more than she let on. The young woman's demeanor, reserved, almost invisible, reminded Miss Marple of a governess in St. Mary Mead, who had concealed a painful past behind a similar mask of reticence. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Lady Beatrice, her face drawn and her eyes shadowed. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" of course," Miss Marple said, gesturing to a chair. "You seem troubled, Lady Beatrice." The older woman sat, her hands twisting in her lap. "I cannot shake the feeling that this theft is a warning. The note, it speaks of things I thought buried. My family has not always been blameless, but I cannot believe anyone here would stoop to blackmail." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And yet, someone has. Tell me, Lady Beatrice, was the brooch insured?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, for a considerable sum. But its sentimental value far outweighs its monetary worth. It was my grandmother's, given to her by a suitor who, well, it's an old story. Old stories," Miss Marple said, "have a way of shaping the present. Perhaps you might share this one?" Lady Beatrice shook her head. "It's nothing, Jane. A romantic entanglement, long forgotten. I only mention it because the brooch was a symbol of that time." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alert. The mention of a suitor, a romantic entanglement, added another thread to the tapestry. She thought of the guests, Charles and Clara, with their tense whispers, Lionel, with his sullen resentment, Dr. Grayson, with his nervous habits, and Sylvia, with her bent hairpin. Each had a motive, however hidden, and the brooch was the key that linked them. As Lady Beatrice left, Miss Marple returned to her notes, adding, 10:30 p.m. Lady Beatrice hints at a romantic scandal tied to the brooch. Insured, but sentimental value emphasized. She lay in bed, the house silent around her, and let her little gray cells work. The hairpin, the thread, the scratch. The note all were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. She sensed that the theft was a prelude, a distraction from a greater crime yet to be revealed. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the smallest details, a bent hairpin, a dropped cup, could unravel the most carefully laid plans. At Thornfield Grange, she was certain the truth was waiting to be found. Chapter 7. A darker tenth dawn broke over Thornfield Grange with a heavy mist that clung to the lawns, shrouding the estate in an eerie silence. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, stood at her bedroom window, her sharp eyes tracing the outlines of the rose garden through the fog. The events of the previous evening, the dropped coffee cup, the bent hairpin, the cryptic conversation with Lady Beatrice, had set her mind abuzz. The sapphire brooch's theft was no longer a simple matter of greed. It was, she sensed, a thread in a tapestry of secrets, one that might soon unravel into something far graver. Breakfast was a subdued affair, the guests' faces drawn with fatigue and suspicion. Charles Ashford was absent, and Clara Vernon explained, with a nervous flutter of her hands, that he had gone to the village to send a telegram. Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer muttered something about irresponsibility, while Lionel lit a cigarette. His eyes narrowed. Dr. Harold Grayson attempted a cheerful remark about the mist, but it fell flat. Miss Sylvia Gray, in a gray dress that made her seem even more invisible, ate in silence. Lady Beatrice, presiding over the table, was pale, her gaze distant. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the empty chair beside Clara. "I trust Mr. Ashford will return soon," she said mildly. "The village is not far, I believe." Clara nodded, her smile strained. "He'll be back by noon. He had business to attend to." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, filing away the vagueness of Clara's response. The morning passed quietly, with Inspector Japp expected to return with the constable to continue the investigation. Miss Marple, however, decided to take matters into her own hands, her curiosity drawn to the library's writing desk, where she had seen the notepaper matching the blackmail note. The library was empty, its air heavy with the scent of old books. Miss Marple approached the desk, her fingers brushing the stack of notepaper. She lifted a sheet, noting its weight and texture, identical to the blackmail note. The fountain pen, still stained with ink, lay beside it. She examined the nib closely, detecting a faint scratch, as if it had been used roughly. A small blotter nearby caught her eye. Beneath it, she found a scrap of paper with a single word scrawled in the same uneven hand as the note, "Legacy." Miss Marple tucked the scrap into her handkerchief, alongside the blue thread and hairpin, her mind racing. The word legacy echoed the blackmail note's threat, suggesting a connection, to Lady Beatrice's cryptic mention of a romantic scandal. She was about to leave when a scream shattered the silence, piercing and raw, from the direction of the rose garden. She hurried to the window, her heart quickening. The mist had begun to lift, revealing a figure lying near the fountain. The guests and servants were already rushing outside, and Miss Marple followed, her steps brisk despite her age. As she reached the garden, she saw Clara kneeling beside the figure, her face ashen. It was Lionel Mortimer, sprawled on the gravel, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. A dark stain spread across his shirt, and a small, ornate dagger lay beside him, its blade glinting in the weak sunlight. Dr. Grayson pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Lionel, his fingers searching for a pulse. After a moment, he shook his head. "He's gone, stabbed through the heart." A murmur of horror rippled through the group. Mrs. Mortimer, arriving late, let out a choked cry and collapsed into a servant's arms. Lady Beatrice stood frozen, her hand clutching the silver key around her neck. Clara, trembling, clung to Charles, who had just returned from the village, his face pale with shock. Miss Sylvia Grey stood apart, her expression unreadable but her hands tightly clasped. Miss Marple's eyes moved from the dagger to the faces around her. The weapon was distinctive, its handle carved with a floral pattern. She recalled seeing a similar dagger in the drawing room, displayed among the family heirlooms near the cabinet. Her gaze lingered on the gravel path, where a faint smear of blood led toward the fountain. She bent down, ostensibly to adjust her shoe, and noted a single blue thread caught in a rosebush nearby. Inspector Japp arrived within the hour, summoned by a frantic telephone call from Lady Beatrice. He surveyed the scene with grim efficiency, ordering the constable to secure the area. "This is no longer just a theft," he said, his voice low. "We've got a murder on our hands." Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, spoke softly. "Indeed, Inspector, and I suspect the two crimes are linked. The dagger, I believe, is from the drawing room. It was near the cabinet, was it not, Lady?" Beatrice nodded, her face ashen. "Yes, it's an old piece, part of the Ashford collection. I didn't notice it was missing." Japp's eyes narrowed. "So our thief is now a killer, or perhaps we've got two culprits. Either way, no one leaves this estate until we sort this out." The guests were herded back to the drawing room, where Japp began his questions. Miss Marple, however, lingered by the fountain, her eyes scanning the ground. The blue thread in the rose bush matched the one from the cabinet, and she wondered if it pointed to the same person or if it was another deliberate distraction. She returned to the house, her mind turning over the new clues, the dagger, the thread, the scrap of paper with the word legacy. In her room, she updated her notes. 10:15 a.m. Lionel Mortimer found dead, stabbed with a dagger from the drawing room. Blue thread in rosebush near body. New clue, scrap of paper in library with word legacy. Dagger links theft to murder. Observations: Clara distraught, Charles defensive, Mrs. Mortimer hysterical, Sylvia withdrawn, Dr. Grayson overly calm. Miss Marple sat back, her little gray cells working furiously. Lionel's death was no random act, it was calculated, tied to the brooch and the blackmail note. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a stolen locket had led to a murder when the thief feared exposure. Here, she suspected, Lionel had known something perhaps about the Ashford legacy and had paid the ultimate price. The dagger, the thread, the note, each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still obscured. As she gazed out at the mist-shrouded garden, Miss Marple felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the certainty that the killer was still among them, watching and waiting. Chapter 8. More lies. Sir Forsyth's drawing room at Thornfield Grange was a cauldron of grief and suspicion, the air thick with the aftermath of Lionel Mortimer's murder. The guests sat in uneasy clusters, their faces pale under the weight of the tragedy. Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer, her eyes red from weeping, clutched a handkerchief, her earlier sharpness replaced by a raw, trembling vulnerability. Clara Vernon sat close to Charles Ashford, her hands twisting in her lap, while Dr. Harold Grayson stood by the window, polishing his spectacles with a nervous rhythm. Miss Sylvia Grey, as ever, was a shadow in the corner, her gray dress blending into the upholstery. Lady Beatrice, her composure fraying, stood by the fireplace, the silver key around her neck glinting in the firelight. Miss Jane Marple, seated with her knitting, observed the scene with her quiet, bird-like intensity. The murder of Lionel had escalated the stakes, transforming the theft of the sapphire brooch into a prelude to violence. The dagger, the blue thread in the rosebush, the scrap of paper with the word legacy, each clue pointed to a deeper motive, one tied to the secrets Lady Beatrice had hinted at. Inspector Japp, pacing the room, was in his element, his brisk questions cutting through the haze of shock. "Right," Japp said, his notebook open. "Lionel Mortimer was stabbed between 9 and 10 this morning, based on Dr. Grayson's estimate. The dagger came from this room, near the cabinet. I need to know where everyone was during that hour." Charles spoke first, his voice tight. "I was in the village, sending a telegram. I got back just as it happened." Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. "I was in the garden, walking. I saw Lionel by the fountain, smoking. Around 9. Then I went inside. I didn't see him again until—" Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Mrs. Mortimer's head snapped up. "You saw him? And you didn't say anything? My son is dead, and you were there." Her voice rose, sharp with accusation. "I didn't know," Clara cried. "I only saw him from a distance. He was alive then." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, noting Clara's distress. Was it grief, fear, or something else? She recalled the blue thread in the rosebush, so like the one in the cabinet hinge, and wondered if Clara's green dress was truly as innocent as it seemed. Dr. Grayson cleared his throat. "I was in the conservatory, as I said before. I heard the scream and ran out. I didn't see Lionel this morning until I examined him." Miss Sylvia Gray spoke softly, her hands folded. "I was in my room, reading. I heard nothing until Clara's scream." Lady Beatrice, her voice strained, added, "I was in my study, going over accounts. I didn't leave until I heard the commotion." Japp scribbled furiously, his frustration evident. "So, once again, no one saw anything useful. But someone took that dagger and used it. And I'll wager it's the same person who took the brooch and wrote that note." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Inspector, if I may, the dagger's presence in the garden is curious. It suggests either premeditation or a sudden act of passion. Have you considered the possibility that Lionel knew something about the brooch, or the legacy mentioned in the note?" Japp shot her a glance. "You think he was silenced, I think." Miss Marple said that people rarely act without reason. In St. Mary Mead, a young man was killed because he knew too much about a stolen painting. Lionel, I suspect, may have known too much about something here. The room fell silent, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Mrs. Mortimer's voice broke the quiet, trembling with rage. "If Lionel knew something, it was because of her." She pointed at Clara. "He never trusted her. He told me yesterday that she was hiding something about Charles's debts." Clara gasped, her face paling. "That's not true. Lionel was always cruel, always trying to stir trouble." Charles stood, his fists clenched. "That's enough, Evelyn. Lionel was a spiteful gossip, and you know it. Clara's done nothing wrong." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Debts, you say, Mrs. Mortimer? That is most interesting. Might I ask what Lionel told you?" Mrs. Mortimer hesitated, her lips pursing. "He said Charles had been borrowing heavily in India. Gambling, perhaps, or bad investments. Lionel overheard him talking to Clara about needing money urgently." Charles's face reddened. "That's nonsense. I've no debts worth mentioning. Lionel was lying to cause trouble, as usual." Miss Marple noted the defensiveness in Charles's tone, the way Clara's hand tightened on his arm. A financial motive, she thought, could explain much. The theft of an insured brooch, the blackmail note, but murder, that required a deeper desperation. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple slipped away to the garden, her eyes drawn to the fountain where Lionel had died. The bloodstain had been cleaned, but the gravel still bore faint marks of disturbance. She knelt, her fingers sifting through the stones, and found a small, crumpled cigarette paper. Half buried, it was singed at the edges, as if someone had tried to burn it. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a scrawled note in the same uneven hand as the blackmail letter. Meet me at 9. Fountain. We talk, or I tell. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The note suggested Lionel had been lured to the garden, perhaps by the blackmailer or the killer. She tucked the paper into her handkerchief, alongside the blue thread hairpin, and the scrap with the word legacy. Returning to the house, she updated her notes to PM. Mrs. Mortimer reveals Charles's possible debts. Clara accused by Lionel. New clue. Cigarette paper with note arranging meeting at fountain. 9.m. Observations. Charles defensive. Clara fearful. Mrs. Mortimer vengeful. Sylvia silent but watchful. Dr. Grayson overly composed. She sat back, her mind turning over the new evidence. The cigarette paper linked Lionel's death to the blackmail note, suggesting he had been a target, not a random victim. His knowledge of Charles's debts or some other secret had made him dangerous. But whose hand had wielded the dagger? Sylvia's hairpin, Clara's presence in the garden, Charles's absence in the village, all were threads in the tapestry. But the pattern was still unclear. As evening approached, Miss Marple joined the guests in the drawing room, where Jap was outlining his next steps. We'll search the rooms tomorrow, he said. If that brooch is here, we'll find it. And I want to know who wrote that second note. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Sylvia, who sat with her hands folded, her face impassive. The hairpin, she thought, was a clue, but so was Sylvia's silence. In St. Mary Mead, a quiet woman had once hidden a deadly secret behind a similar facade. Here, at Thornfield Grange, Miss Marple sensed the truth was close, waiting for her little gray cells to weave the threads together. Chapter 9. The emotional turning point. The atmosphere at Thornfield Grange had grown oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in under the weight of Lionel Mortimer's murder and the unresolved theft of the sapphire brooch. The mist had cleared, but a heavy silence lingered, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house or the distant clatter of servants' footsteps. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room with her knitting untouched, reviewed her growing collection of clues: the blue thread, the bent hairpin, the scrap of paper with the word legacy, and now the cigarette paper with its ominous summons to the fountain. Each was a fragment of the truth, but the puzzle was far from complete. Downstairs, the guests were restless, their nerves frayed by Inspector Japp's promise of a room-by-room search. Miss Marple, ever observant, had noted the subtle shifts in their behavior: Charles Ashford's clenched jaw, Clara Vernon's tearful glances, Dr. Harold Grayson's forced cheer, and Miss Sylvia Gray's watchful silence. Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer, still reeling from her son's death, had retreated to her room, her grief tinged with a bitter edge that Miss Marple found telling. As luncheon approached, Miss Marple joined the others in the dining room, where the mood was somber. Lady Beatrice, presiding over the table, attempted to maintain decorum, but her hands trembled as she poured tea. The conversation was stilted, with Clara's soft remark about the weather met with strained nods. It was then that Dr. Grayson, perhaps seeking to ease the tension, made a fatal misstep. I must say, he began, his tone overly bright, Lionel's loss is tragic, but we mustn't let it overshadow the happy occasion of Charles and Clara's engagement. A toast, perhaps, to brighter days. The room froze, Clara's fork clattered to her plate, and Charles's face darkened. Mrs. Mortimer, who had joined the meal despite her grief, rose abruptly, her eyes blazing. "How dare you?" she cried, her voice raw. "My son is dead, murdered in this house. And you speak of toasts, you, who've been hovering about like a vulture, pretending to care." Dr. Grayson paled, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Mrs. Mortimer, I meant no offense. You meant to distract," she snapped. "I saw you yesterday, skulking near the drawing room before the brooch went missing, and Lionel told me he didn't trust you, that you'd been asking questions about the family, poking into things that don't concern you." The accusation hung in the air, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Mrs. Mortimer's outburst, though emotional, revealed a new thread: Dr. Grayson's curiosity about the Ashfords. She recalled his nervous habit of polishing his spectacles, his overly calm demeanor at the murder scene, and wondered what he might have been seeking. Lady Beatrice intervened, her voice sharp. "Evelyn, this is not the time. We are all grieving, and accusations help no one." But Mrs. Mortimer was not to be silenced. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to Clara. "And you, Lionel, said you were desperate for money, that you and Charles were scheming. He knew something, didn't he? That's why he's dead." Clara's face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands, sobbing. Charles stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough," he roared. "Lionel was a liar and a troublemaker. He had no proof of anything, and I won't have Clara slandered." Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the raw emotion in Clara's sobs, the fury in Charles's defense. But it was Sylvia Gray's reaction that caught her attention. The young woman, usually so composed, had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. For a moment, her eyes met Miss Marple's, and there was a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or guilt. The luncheon broke up in disarray, with Mrs. Mortimer storming out and Clara retreating to her room. Charles at her side, Miss Marple lingered, her mind turning over the outburst. Mrs. Mortimer's accusations, though driven by grief, had exposed fault lines in the group. Charles's possible debts, Dr. Grayson's prying, Clara's fear, and Sylvia's reaction suggested she, too, was hiding something, seeking solitude. Miss Marple slipped into the conservatory, where the air was warm and heavy with the scent of orchids. She sat on a wicker bench, her eyes scanning the rows of plants, when she noticed a small gardening trowel half hidden beneath a pot. Its blade was stained with what looked like dried blood. Though it was too faint to be certain, she retrieved it carefully, wrapping it in her handkerchief alongside her other clues. The trowel, she thought, could be a red herring or evidence of a second weapon. As she returned to the house, she encountered Sylvia Gray in the hall, her face still pale. "Miss Marple," Sylvia said softly, I must speak with you." Miss Marple nodded, gesturing to a nearby sitting room. Once seated, Sylvia's composure cracked, her voice trembling. "I can't keep silent any longer. Lionel, he wasn't what he seemed. He came to me last night, after dinner," he said. "He knew who took the brooch, and he wanted my help to confront them. I refused. I was frightened. But now he's dead, and I feel responsible." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but probing. "And did he say who he suspected?" Sylvia shook her head, her hands twisting. "No, but he was angry, especially with Clara. He said she was playing a dangerous game. I don't know what he meant, but I think he was trying to protect me." "Protect you?" Miss Marple asked, her tone soft. "From what, Miss Gray?" Sylvia hesitated, then whispered, "From the truth about the Ashfords. There's something about that brooch, something Lady Beatrice doesn't want known. Lionel hinted at it, but he wouldn't say more." Miss Marple's mind raced. Sylvia's confession, though partial, was a crack in the facade, revealing the depth of the secrets at Thornfield Grange. She thought of the hairpin, the blue thread, the note arranging Lionel's fatal meeting. Was Sylvia a victim, a conspirator, or both? She updated her notes, 1:30 p.m. Mrs. Mortimer accuses Dr. Grayson. And Clara. Sylvia reveals Lionel's suspicion of Clara and knowledge of the brooch's secret. New clue, gardening trowel with possible bloodstain in conservatory. Observations. Clara's breakdown. Charles's anger, Sylvia's fear, Dr. Grayson's unease, Mrs. Mortimer's vengeance. As Sylvia left, Miss Marple sat back, her little gray cells humming. The trowel, the notes, the accusations all pointed to a web of lies, with the brooch and the Ashford legacy at its center. In St. Mary Mead, a widow's outburst had once led to the discovery of a hidden affair. Here, Mrs. Mortimer's grief and Sylvia's confession were peeling back layers, but the core of the truth remained elusive. Miss Marple knew the killer was close, their motives tangled in the past, and she resolved to watch even more closely as the house descended into chaos. Chapter 10. The trapped afternoon light filtered weakly through the windows of Thornfield Grange, casting long shadows across the drawing room where the guests were gathered once more. The air was thick with tension, the weight of Lionel Mortimer's murder and the missing sapphire brooch pressing down on everyone. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles still, her eyes bright with the quiet intensity of a mind piecing together a complex puzzle. The clues she had gathered: the blue thread, the bent hairpin, the scrap of paper with legacy, the cigarette paper, and the blood-stained trowel formed a constellation of evidence. But the pattern was not yet complete. She sensed, however, that the time had come to apply pressure, to set a trap that would force the truth into the open. Inspector Japp stood by the fireplace, his notebook tucked away, his expression grim. The room-by-room search had yielded nothing, no brooch, no further clues, leaving the investigation at a standstill. The guests, seated in a tense semicircle, avoided each other's eyes. Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer, her face etched with grief, clutched her handkerchief. Charles Ashford and Clara Vernon sat close together, his hand protective on hers. Dr. Harold Grayson polished his spectacles, his movements jerky. Miss Sylvia Gray, pale and silent, seemed to shrink into her chair, while Lady Beatrice, standing by the cabinet, fingered the silver key around her neck. Miss Marple cleared her throat, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Inspector, if I may, I believe we are approaching this matter from the wrong angle. The brooch, the note, and poor Mr. Mortimer's death are not separate crimes, but parts of a single design. I propose a small experiment to clarify matters." Japp raised an eyebrow, accustomed to Miss Marple's unconventional methods. "An experiment, eh? Go on." Then Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Let us suppose the brooch is still in this house, hidden not in a room but in plain sight, where no one would think to look. And let us suppose the killer believes their secret is safe. If we were to create a moment of uncertainty, we might see who reacts most strongly." Lady Beatrice frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple, "A gathering," Miss Marple replied, "here, tonight, in this very room. We shall say that new evidence has come to light, evidence that points to the thief and the murderer. I shall ask each of you to account for a specific moment, where you were at 9 this morning, when Lionel was killed, and I shall present a theory about the brooch's hiding place. The guilty party, I think, will betray themselves." Japp nodded slowly. "A trap, you mean? Stir the pot and see who jumps." "I like it. We'll do it after dinner. Everyone's to be here, no exceptions." The guests murmured, some with unease, others with reluctant agreement. Miss Marple noted their reactions. Clara's hand tightened on Charles's. Dr. Grayson's spectacles slipped from his fingers, and Sylvia's eyes darted toward the door. Mrs. Mortimer's lips pursed, but she said nothing, her grief a shield against further argument. Dinner was a strained affair, the clink of cutlery sounding unnaturally loud. Miss Marple, seated beside Lady Beatrice, spoke little, her mind focused on the evening's plan. She had chosen her words carefully, planting the seed of doubt without revealing her hand. The clues: the hairpin, the thread, the notes pointed to a motive rooted in the Ashford legacy, but she needed a reaction to confirm her suspicions. At 8 o'clock, the guests reassembled in the drawing room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Japp stood by the cabinet, his presence authoritative, while Miss Marple took her place near the hearth, her knitting folded in her lap. The atmosphere was electric, each guest poised on the edge of their seat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Japp began, "Miss Marple has a theory, and I've agreed to let her test it. We've got a murder, a theft, and a blackmail note, and they're all connected. Miss Marple." Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Thank you, Inspector. Let us begin with the brooch. It was taken from a locked cabinet. Yet the lock was not forced. The scratch on the glass, I believe, was a distraction, meant to suggest tampering. But suppose the thief had access to the key or a copy of it. Lady Beatrice, you keep the key around your neck, but keys can be duplicated, can they not?" Lady Beatrice's hand flew to the silver key. "Impossible. I've never let it out of my sight." "Yet someone took the brooch," Miss Marple continued. "And then there is the blackmail note, threatening to reveal the Ashford legacy. I wonder, Lady Beatrice, if that legacy involves a scandal, perhaps a romantic entanglement." As you hinted, Lady Beatrice stiffened, but before she could respond, Mrs. Mortimer interjected, her voice sharp. "A scandal. Of course there's a scandal. My son knew about it, something about your grandmother and a suitor who was cheated. Lionel said the brooch was proof of it. The room stirred, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Proof, you say? That is most interesting. And Lionel, I believe, arranged a meeting at the fountain to discuss this proof. A note, found near his body, suggests he was lured there and killed to keep him silent. Clara gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Charles's face darkened, and Dr. Grayson's spectacles fell to the floor. Sylvia Gray, however, remained still, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple. Now, Miss Marple said, let us consider the moment of Lionel's death. 9 o'clock, by the fountain. Clara, you were in the garden, were you not? And Dr. Grayson, you were in the conservatory nearby. Miss Gray, you were in your room, but the window overlooks the garden. Charles, you were in the village, and Lady Beatrice, you were in your study. Yet someone took the dagger from this room and used it. I wonder, was it hidden in plain sight? Like the brooch, she paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Suppose the brooch is still here, in this very room, hidden where we least expect it. Suppose I were to say I know where it is and who took it. Would the guilty party care to confess? The silence was deafening. Then, with a sudden movement, Sylvia Gray stood, her face pale but resolute. Stop this, Miss Marple. I can't let this go on. I took the brooch. A collective gasp filled the room. Jap stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand. Please, Miss Gray, go on. Sylvia's voice trembled. I took it to protect Lady Beatrice. The brooch, it's tied to a secret about her grandmother, a scandal that would ruin the family's name. Lionel found out and was going to expose it. I thought if I hid the brooch, he'd have no proof. But I didn't kill him, I swear it. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was racing. Sylvia's confession was a crack in the facade, but it was incomplete. The hairpin, the thread, the blood-stained trowel all suggested a deeper truth. She spoke gently. Thank you, Miss Gray, but I fear the brooch is only part of the story. The killer, I believe, is still among us. She turned to the cabinet, her fingers brushing the velvet stand. The brooch is here, is it not? Hidden in the lining of this stand, where no one thought to look. Jap, following her lead, lifted the velvet stand and slit the lining with a pocket knife. A glint of sapphire emerged, and he held up the brooch, its cold fire catching the light. The room erupted in murmurs, but Miss Marple's eyes were on the guests, watching for the one whose reaction would betray them. Her trap had sprung, but the killer had not yet revealed themselves. She updated her notes in her mind. 8:30 p.m. Sylvia confesses to stealing brooch to protect Lady Beatrice. Brooch found in velvet stand. Observations. Sylvia's partial confession, others' shock. Killer's identity still hidden. The truth was close, Miss Marple knew, and the final reveal was imminent. In St. Mary Mead, a confession had once unmasked a murderer. Here, at Thornfield Grange, she was certain the same would hold true. Chapter 11. The revealed drawing room at Thornfield Grange was a tableau of stunned faces, the sapphire brooch glinting in Inspector Japp's hand like a cold star. Miss Sylvia Gray's confession to stealing the brooch had sent ripples of shock through the gathered guests, but Miss Jane Marple, seated by the hearth with her knitting folded in her lap, knew the drama was far from over. The recovery of the brooch, hidden in the lining of the velvet stand, had confirmed her suspicion that the theft was a calculated act, but the murder of Lionel Mortimer pointed to a deeper, more sinister motive. Her little gray cells, as she called them, were now poised to unravel the final threads of the mystery. Inspector Japp, holding the brooch, turned to Sylvia, his voice stern. Miss Gray, you've admitted to theft, but you claim you didn't kill Lionel Mortimer. You'd better explain yourself fully, or you're in deeper trouble than you think. Sylvia's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clasped them. I told you. I took the brooch to protect Lady Beatrice. Lionel knew about the scandal, her grandmother's affair with a man who was cheated out of his inheritance. The brooch was a gift from him, a symbol of that betrayal. Lionel threatened to expose it, to ruin the Ashford name. I thought if I hid the brooch, he'd have no proof. I didn't write the blackmail note, and I didn't kill him. Lady Beatrice, standing by the cabinet, gripped the silver key around her neck, her face ashen. Sylvia, why didn't you tell me? I could have handled Lionel. Sylvia's eyes filled with tears. I was afraid, my lady. You've been so kind to me, and I couldn't bear to see you humiliated." Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, cut through the tension. "Miss Grey, your loyalty is admirable. But I fear you have not told us everything. The hairpin I found. With its bent tip, did you use it to tamper with the cabinet?" Sylvia's eyes widened. "No, I used it to pin the lining of the stand after I hid the brooch. I didn't scratch the glass." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. "Then let us turn to the murder. Lionel was lured to the fountain at 9 this morning, as evidenced by the note on the cigarette paper, 'Meet me at 9. Fountain. We talk, or I tell.' He was stabbed with a dagger from this room, a dagger anyone could have taken. But the killer, I believe, was someone who feared what Lionel knew, not just about the brooch, but about a secret far more dangerous. Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer. Her grief glared at Clara Vernon. It was her. Lionel told me she and Charles were desperate for money. He knew they were scheming, and they killed him to keep him quiet." Clara's face crumpled, and she clutched Charles's arm. "That's not true. I loved Lionel, even if he was cruel. I would never hurt him." Charles stood, his voice shaking with fury. "Enough, Evelyn. Lionel was a blackmailer, trying to ruin us. But I didn't kill him. I was in the village." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, Mr. Ashford, your alibi is convenient, but let us consider another possibility. The blue thread I found in the cabinet hinge and the rosebush near Lionel's body suggests someone was present at both scenes. Miss Grey wore a blue blouse yesterday, but today she is in gray. Dr. Grayson, however, has a blue tie, and I noticed a similar shade in the lining of your waistcoat, Mr. Ashford." Dr. Grayson fumbled his spectacles, his face paling. I was in the conservatory. I told you," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but relentless. "And then there is the trowel I found in the conservatory, stained with what may be blood. Dr. Grayson, you were there this morning, were you not? And you were quick to examine Lionel's body, perhaps to ensure he was dead." The room gasped, and Dr. Grayson's hands shook. "This is preposterous. I'm a doctor, not a murderer." Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice calm. "Let us piece it together. The brooch was stolen to prevent Lionel from using it as leverage in his blackmail scheme. The blackmail note, threatening to reveal the Ashford legacy, was written to pressure Lady Beatrice, but Lionel's knowledge went beyond the brooch. He knew something that threatened someone in this room, something worth killing for." She turned to Lady Beatrice. "Your grandmother's suitor, I believe, was more than a jilted lover. He was cheated out of a share of the Ashford estate, was he not? And that suitor, I suspect, was Dr. Grayson's grandfather." A stunned silence fell. Dr. Grayson's spectacles fell to the floor, and he made no move to retrieve them. Lady Beatrice's hand tightened on the key, her voice a whisper. How did you know?" "In St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple said. "A family feud was uncovered by a single letter. Here, the clues were scattered but clear. Dr. Grayson, your questions about the Ashford family, your presence in the conservatory near the murder scene, the trowel with blood all point to you. You wrote the blackmail note, hoping to force Lady Beatrice to acknowledge the old injustice. When Lionel learned of it, perhaps through his own prying, you lured him to the fountain and killed him to keep your secret." Dr. Grayson's face contorted, and he sank into a chair, his voice breaking. "It's true, my grandfather was ruined by the Ashfords. The brooch was his gift, a promise of marriage, but Beatrice's grandmother betrayed him for wealth. I wanted justice, not murder. Lionel found an old letter in the library, proof of the scandal. He was going to expose it, to ruin me as well. As Beatrice, I panicked. I took the dagger, met him at the fountain, and he buried his face in his hands, sobbing." Japp stepped forward, his voice firm. "Dr. Harold Grayson, you're under arrest for the murder of Lionel Mortimer." Miss Marple sat back, her expression serene but tinged with sadness. The room was silent, the guests staring in disbelief. Sylvia's confession had been a half-truth, meant to protect Lady Beatrice. But Dr. Grayson's desperation had led to murder. The blue thread, she realized, had come from his tie, caught in the rosebush during the struggle. The trowel had been a clumsy attempt to hide the dagger's blood. She updated her notes in her mind. 9 p.m. Dr. Grayson confesses to murder, motivated by family grudge. Brooch recovered, blackmail note explained. Observations, Sylvia's loyalty, Clara's innocence. Charles's debts irrelevant, Lady Beatrice's secret exposed. The truth had been revealed. But Miss Marple felt no triumph. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how old wounds could fester, leading to tragedy. Here, at Thornfield Grange, the past had claimed another victim, and her little gray cells had merely brought it to light. Chapter 12. The reflection-thay drawing room at Thornfield Grange was cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the dying fire. Dr. Harold Grayson, his confession hanging in the air like a bitter fog, sat slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. Inspector Japp, with a brisk nod to the constable, had placed handcuffs on the doctor, whose earlier joviality had crumbled into a shell of despair. The sapphire brooch, now resting on the velvet stand in the cabinet, seemed to gleam with a cold triumph, its return overshadowed by the grim truth of Lionel Mortimer's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the hearth, folded her knitting with deliberate care, her sharp eyes softened by a trace of melancholy. The guests, Lady Beatrice, Charles Ashford, Clara Vernon, Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer, and Miss Sylvia Gray sat in stunned silence, each grappling with the weight of the revelation. The Ashford legacy, a scandal of betrayal and greed, had driven Dr. Grayson to blackmail and murder, and Miss Marple's little gray cells had unraveled the tangled threads. With her characteristic precision, Japp cleared his throat, addressing the room. Well, that's that. Dr. Grayson will be taken to the station, and the brooch is back where it belongs. Thanks to Miss Marple, we've got our man. Lady Beatrice, her face pale but composed, spoke softly. Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough. You've saved my family's name, though at such a cost. I should have told you about the scandal from the start. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. My dear Lady Beatrice, secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply buried. In St. Mary Mead, I once helped a family uncover a hidden will, and it brought them peace, though not without pain. Here, the truth has been costly, but it is better known than hidden. Charles Ashford, his arm around Clara, looked at Miss Marple. With gratitude, you cleared Clara's name, Miss Marple. Lionel's lies about her, and my supposed debts, they could have ruined us. Double quotes Clara. Her eyes red from tears, nodded. I thought I'd never be free of suspicion. Thank you, Miss Marple. Mrs. Mortimer, her grief raw but her anger subdued, spoke haltingly. I was wrong to accuse Clara. My son was not perfect, but I loved him. I wish I'd known what he was entangled in. Miss Marple's gaze softened further. Grief can blind us, Mrs. Mortimer, but it also sharpens our understanding of those we've lost. Lionel, I believe, was caught in a web not entirely of his own making. Miss Sylvia Gray, who had confessed to stealing the brooch, sat quietly, her hands folded. I only wanted to protect Lady Beatrice, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never imagined it would lead to this. Miss Marple nodded. Your loyalty, Miss Gray, was misguided but sincere. The hairpin, the blue thread, these were small mistakes, but they helped guide us to the truth. Japp, preparing to escort Dr. Grayson out, paused. Miss Marple, you've a knack for this. That business with the thread and the trowel, how did you know? Miss Marple smiled faintly. In St. Mary Mead, Inspector, I learned that people are like patterns in a tapestry. Their actions, their habits, their lies, they leave traces, like threads caught in a rosebush. Dr. Grayson's tie, his presence in the conservatory, his nervous habits, they told a story. The trowel, I suspect, was used to clean the dagger, a clumsy attempt to hide the blood. Dr. Grayson, his voice hollow, spoke without looking up. I only wanted justice for my grandfather. The Ashfords took everything from him. When Lionel found that letter, I knew he'd use it against me. I lost control. Miss Marple's eyes held a quiet sadness. Desperation, Dr. Grayson, is a dangerous master. It blinds us to reason, as it did you. As Japp led Grayson away, the guests began to disperse, their movements slow, as if the weight of the truth still held them. Lady Beatrice approached Miss Marple, her voice low. Jane, will you stay another day? I fear we shall need your wisdom to heal these wounds." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I shall stay until tomorrow, Lady Beatrice, but healing, I find, comes from facing the truth, however painful." Alone in the drawing room, Miss Marple stood by the cabinet, her fingers brushing the sapphire brooch. It was a beautiful thing, but its beauty was tainted by the greed and betrayal it had symbolized. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where small betrayals often mirrored larger ones, and of the many lives undone by secrets. Her little gray cells had solved the mystery, but the cost Lionel's life. Grayson's ruin reminded her of the fragility of human nature. She returned to her room and updated her notes one final time. 10 p.m. Dr. Grayson arrested for Lionel's murder. Motive: family grudge over Ashford legacy. Brooch returned, scandal exposed. Observations: Lady Beatrice relieved but shaken, Clara and Charles exonerated, Sylvia regretful. Mrs. Mortimer softened by grief. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple gazed out at the darkened garden, where the fountain stood silent under the stars. The truth had been found, but it was not a victory. It was, she thought, a reminder that even the quietest villages and the grandest estates held shadows that only patience and observation could illuminate. With a sigh, she turned down the lamp, her mind already turning to the next puzzle life might bring. Chapter 13. The lingering shadows. The morning sun rose over Thornfield Grange, its golden rays doing little to dispel the chill that lingered in the hearts of its inhabitants. The revelation of Dr. Harold Grayson's guilt in the murder of Lionel Mortimer and the recovery of the sapphire brooch had brought a semblance of resolution. But the house remained steeped in an uneasy quiet. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table with a cup of tea, observed the subdued gathering with her characteristic attentiveness. The guests, though relieved that the killer had been unmasked, were still grappling with the weight of exposed secrets and fractured relationships. Lady Beatrice Ashford, at the head of the table, was pale but composed, her silver key no longer around her neck, as if the brooch's return had lifted a burden she had carried too long. Charles Ashford and Clara Vernon sat close, their hands clasped, their faces reflecting a fragile hope now that suspicion no longer shadowed them. Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer, her grief softened by exhaustion, picked at her food in silence, her eyes occasionally darting toward the empty chair where Lionel would have sat. Miss Sylvia Gray, her confession to stealing the brooch still fresh, kept her gaze lowered, her gray dress blending into the muted tones of the room. Miss Marple, her knitting resting in her lap, sipped her tea and let her thoughts wander. The case was solved, yet something nagged at her, a loose thread in the tapestry of events. The blue thread, the bent hairpin, the blackmail note, the blood-stained trowel, all had pointed to Dr. Grayson, but she could not shake the feeling that the Ashford legacy held more secrets than had been revealed. In St. Mary Mead, she had once uncovered a second motive behind a seemingly solved crime, and she wondered if Thornfield Grange might yield a similar surprise. After breakfast, Lady Beatrice approached Miss Marple, her voice low. "Jane, you've done us a great service, but I fear the wounds of this weekend will take time to heal. Will you walk with me in the garden? I need your counsel." Miss Marple nodded. Rising with her usual quiet grace, the two women stepped into the rose garden, where the air was crisp and the flowers bowed under the weight of morning dew. The fountain, scene of Lionel's murder, stood silent, its waters glinting in the sunlight. Lady Beatrice paused by it, her expression troubled. "The scandal about my grandmother," she began. "It's true, as you guessed. She betrayed a suitor, Dr. Grayson's grandfather, for a wealthier match. The brooch was his gift, a promise she broke. I kept it as a reminder of our family's flaws, but I never imagined it would lead to such tragedy." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. "Families, Lady Beatrice, are like old houses full of hidden rooms and forgotten stories. But there is something else troubling you, is there not?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her fingers twisting together. "It's Sylvia, her confession. It doesn't sit right with me. She's been with me for years, loyal to a fault. Why would she steal the brooch without telling me? And that blackmail note, it doesn't sound like her." Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind returning to Sylvia's pale face, her trembling hands during the confession. "Indeed, it is curious, Miss Gray's actions were driven by loyalty, but perhaps not only to you. In St. Mary Mead, a young woman once took the blame for a theft to protect someone she loved. I wonder if Miss Gray is shielding someone else, lady. Beatrice's eyes widened. Shielding someone, but who? Before Miss Marple could respond, a soft cry came from the house. They hurried back to find Clara in the hall, her face ashen, clutching a letter. Charles was at her side, his expression a mix of concern and anger. The other guests gathered, drawn by the commotion. "What is it, Clara?" Lady Beatrice asked, her voice sharp with worry. Clara's voice trembled as she handed over the letter. "It was under my door this morning. I don't understand." Miss Marple took the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar uneven hand. "You thought it was over. But the truth is not done. The legacy lives, and so does the debt." The note was unsigned, but its tone echoed the earlier blackmail letter. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Dr. Grayson was in custody, so who had written this? She glanced at the guests, Mrs. Mortimer, her face hardening, Sylvia, her eyes wide with fear, Charles, his jaw tight. Inspector Japp, who had arrived to finalize his report, took the letter with a frown. "Another note. This is getting out of hand. Grayson's locked up. So who's playing games now?" Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "Inspector, this note suggests the Ashford legacy holds more secrets than we've uncovered. Dr. Grayson killed Lionel to protect his family's claim, but perhaps someone else feels entitled to retribution or recompense." She turned to Sylvia. "Miss Gray, you said you took the brooch to protect Lady Beatrice, but was there another reason? Someone you were protecting, perhaps?" Sylvia's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, her voice barely audible. It was for Clara. She's my cousin, though no one knows. She told me about Charles's debts in India, how desperate they were. I thought if I hid the brooch, it could be claimed on insurance, and they'd have the money they needed. I didn't write the first note. I swear I only hid the brooch." Clara gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Sylvia, why didn't you tell me? I never wanted this." Charles's face darkened. "Clara's debts are mine to handle. I didn't know about Sylvia's plan, and I certainly didn't kill Lionel." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "But someone did, and someone wrote this new note." "Mrs. Mortimer, you spoke of Lionel's suspicions about Clara and Charles. Did he share anything else with you, something about another debt or grievance?" Mrs. Mortimer's lips trembled, but she shook her head. "He only said Clara was trouble, that she'd ruined Charles. I didn't believe him at first. But now," Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The new note suggested a second conspirator, someone aware of the scandal but with their own agenda. She thought of the cigarette paper, the blue thread, the trowel clues that had pointed to Grayson. But perhaps they had also obscured another's involvement. She updated her notes in her mind. 9:30 a.m. New blackmail note found under Clara's door. Sylvia reveals she is Clara's cousin. Hid brooch for her sake. Observations. Clara distraught. Charles defensive. Sylvia guilty. Mrs. Mortimer evasive. Second conspirator possible. As Japp questioned the guests further, Miss Marple sat back, her little gray cells humming. The case was not closed, she realized. Dr. Grayson's confession had resolved the murder, but the new note hinted at a lingering threat, a shadow of the past that refused to fade. In St. Mary Mead, she had once found a second culprit hiding behind the first. At Thornfield Grange, she suspected. The final truth was still waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 14. The final thread's discovery of the second blackmail note had cast a fresh pall over Thornfield Grange. Its cryptic words, "The legacy lives, and so does the debt," reigniting the tension that had only just begun to ease. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her tea and her knitting, felt the weight of the unresolved mystery pressing upon her. Dr. Harold Grayson's confession to Lionel Mortimer's murder had seemed to close the case, but the new note, written in the same uneven hand, suggested a deeper conspiracy, one that her little gray cells were determined to unravel. Inspector Japp, his mustache bristling with frustration, paced the room, the note in his hand. "This is madness," he muttered. "Grayson's in custody, the brooch is back, and now another note. Someone's playing a dangerous game. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression was grave. Indeed, Inspector, but games, you see, have rules, even if they are hidden. This note suggests someone else knows of the Ashford legacy and believes they are owed something. We must look to the past to understand the present. The guests were summoned once more to the drawing room, their faces a mix of exhaustion and dread. Lady Beatrice stood by the fireplace, her composure fraying at the edges. Charles Ashford and Clara Vernon sat close, their hands clasped, while Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer, her grief now laced with suspicion, glared at them. Miss Sylvia Grey, her confession to stealing the brooch still raw, sat with her head bowed, her gray dress making her almost invisible. Jap held up the note. This was found under Miss Vernon's door this morning. It's clear someone in this house is still trying to stir trouble. I want answers, and I want them now. Miss Marple, her voice, soft but commanding, spoke up. Inspector, if I may, let us consider the clues we have. The blue thread, found in the cabinet, and the rose bush, pointed us to Dr. Grayson's tie. The bent hairpin led us to Miss Grey's attempt to hide the brooch. The trowel in the conservatory, stained with blood, confirmed Grayson's guilt in the murder. But this new note, it matches the first in handwriting, yet Grayson could not have written it. Someone else is involved, someone with knowledge of the Ashford scandal and a motive to exploit it. She turned to Mrs. Mortimer. You mentioned Lionel's suspicions about Clara and Charles's debts. Did he ever speak of another grievance, perhaps tied to the family's past? Mrs. Mortimer's lips tightened, her eyes flickering with unease. He did say something odd, the night before he died. He said the Ashfords weren't the only ones with secrets. He mentioned a servant, someone who'd been wronged years ago. I thought he was just being spiteful. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A servant? That is most interesting. Lady Beatrice, you trust your staff implicitly, but might there be one with a connection to the past? Lady Beatrice frowned, her hand instinctively reaching for the absent key around her neck. My staff are loyal. Hodges has been with us for years, and the maids are local girls, none with any grudge. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Hodges, the gruff chauffeur who had avoided her gaze during questioning. She recalled his presence at the edge of every scene, his quiet efficiency, and the way he had lingered near the drawing room the night the brooch was discovered missing. Inspector, she said, might we speak with Hodges? His role in the household gives him access to every room, including the drawing room and the garden. Jap nodded, sending for the chauffeur. Hodges entered, his weathered face impassive, his hands clasped behind his back. You wanted me, sir. Jap held up the note. This was found this morning. Know anything about it? Hodges shook his head, his eyes steady. No, sir. I've been busy with the car and the grounds. Haven't seen any notes. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle. Mr. Hodges, you've served the Ashfords for many years, have you? Not long enough, perhaps, to know of their history, the scandal involving Lady Beatrice's grandmother, and a suitor who was wronged. Hodges's jaw tightened, a flicker of unease crossing his face. I don't pry into family matters, ma'am. Of course, Miss Marple said. But in St. Mary Mead, I once knew a gardener who carried a grudge for decades. Passed down from his father, it led to a theft, you see, to right an old wrong. I wonder if you might have a similar story, a family member, perhaps, who felt cheated by the Ashfords. The room fell silent, and Hodges's composure cracked, his hands clenching. My father, he said at last, his voice low. He was a footman here, years ago. He loved Beatrice's grandmother, but she cast him aside for a richer man. The brooch was his mother's, given to her as a promise. When she broke it, it broke him. I wrote the notes, not the first one, but the second. I wanted the Ashfords to pay, to acknowledge what they did. Jap's eyes narrowed. And the first note, Grayson's work. Hodges nodded. I found it in the library after he wrote it. I copied the hand. Thought I'd use it to push them harder. But I didn't kill Mr. Mortimer. I swear it. Miss Marple's eyes softened. I believe you, Mr. Hodges. Your grievance was with the past, not with Lionel. But your note stirred the pot, keeping the fear alive. Jap sighed, tucking the note into his pocket. Right. Hodges, "You're coming with me for questioning. This blackmail business stops here." As Hodges was led away, Miss Marple updated her notes in her mind. 11 a.m. Hodges confesses to writing second blackmail note. Motivated by his father's betrayal. No involvement in murder. Observations. Lady Beatrice shaken. Clara and Charles relieved. Sylvia silent. Mrs. Mortimer subdued. The guests dispersed, their relief tempered by the lingering pain of the weekend's events. Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, her gaze on the sapphire brooch. The final thread had been tied. But the cost Lionel's life, Grayson's ruin. Hodges's bitterness was a stark reminder of the past's long reach. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how old wounds could poison the present. At Thornfield Grange, the lesson was the same, but the stakes had been far higher. Chapter 15. The quiet departure. The sun hung low over Thornfield Grange, its golden light softening the harsh edges of the estate's red brick facade. The events of the past few days, the theft of the sapphire brooch, the murder of Lionel Mortimer, the unmasking of Dr. Harold Grayson as the killer, and the revelation of Hodges's blackmail attempt had left the household in a state of weary resolution. Miss Jane Marple, her small suitcase packed, stood in the grand hall, her eyes taking in the familiar portraits of Ashford's past. Their stern faces a silent testament to the family's tangled history. Lady Beatrice Ashford, her composure restored, but her eyes shadowed, approached Miss Marple with a grateful smile. "Jane, I cannot express how much your presence has meant to us. You've brought clarity to a darkness I feared would consume us." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression was tinged with sadness. "My dear Lady Beatrice, clarity is often a painful gift, but it is better than living in the shadow of lies. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen how secrets, left unchecked, can fester. Here, the truth has been costly, but it has set you free." Charles Ashford and Clara Vernon joined them, their hands clasped, their faces lighter now that suspicion no longer clouded their engagement. "Miss Marple," Charles said, his voice earnest, "you've given us a chance to start anew. Clara and I owe you everything." Clara nodded, her auburn hair catching the light. "I was so afraid, but you saw through the lies. Thank you." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Fear, Miss Vernon, often blinds us to the truth, but love has a way of enduring. You and Mr. Ashford must hold fast to that." Double quotes Mrs. Evelyn Mortimer, her grief softened by time, approached with a hesitant nod. "Miss Marple, I was wrong to accuse so hastily. My son, he was not blameless, but I see now he was caught in something larger. I'm grateful you found the truth." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Grief, Mrs. Mortimer, can make us see enemies where there are only victims. Lionel's death was a tragedy, but understanding it may bring you peace." Miss Sylvia Gray, standing quietly by the staircase, spoke softly. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple, for my part in this. I thought I was helping Clara, but I only made things worse." Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. "Miss Gray, your loyalty was misguided, but your heart was true. Learn from this and let it guide you forward." Inspector Japp, who had overseen Hodges's questioning and Dr. Grayson's transfer to custody, joined the group, his mustache twitching with a rare smile. "Miss Marple, you've done it again. That business with the thread, the hairpin, and those notes, I'd have been chasing my tail without you." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Inspector, you give me too much credit. I merely observe what people reveal, often without knowing it. In St. Mary Mead, a misplaced glove once solved a theft. Here, it was a thread, a trowel, and a few words on paper." Japp shook his head. "Well, Hodges is facing charges for blackmail, but he's no murderer. Grayson's confession holds, and the case is closed. You're welcome to stay. You know, might be nice to have a quiet day for once." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "A kind offer, Inspector, but I think St. Mary Mead calls me home. My roses need tending, and there are always new puzzles to be found, even in a quiet village." As the chauffeur, now a temporary replacement for Hodges, brought the car round, Miss Marple took a final look at the drawing room, where the sapphire brooch rested in its cabinet, its beauty now a somber reminder of greed and betrayal. She thought of the clues that had led her to the truth, the blue thread from Grayson's tie, Caught in the cabinet and rosebush, the bent hairpin, evidence of Sylvia's desperate act. The trowel, a clumsy attempt to hide Grayson's crime. And the notes, one from Grayson, one from Hodges, both rooted in the same old wound the Ashford legacy. She stepped into the car, her mind already turning to the familiar comforts of her cottage. As the Rolls-Royce crunched down the gravel drive, she reflected on the nature of human folly. The Ashford scandal, a betrayal from generations past, had sparked a chain of events that claimed a life and shattered others. Yet, in its wake, there was hope. Clara and Charles's love, Sylvia's redemption, Lady Beatrice's resolve to face her family's past. In her mind, she finalized her notes. 3 p.m. Case closed. Dr. Grayson guilty of murder. Hodges of blackmail. Brooch returned. Legacy exposed. Observations. Lady Beatrice resilient. Charles and Clara hopeful. Sylvia repentant. Mrs. Mortimer softened. Truth brings closure, but scars remain. As the car wound through the countryside, Miss Marple gazed out at the rolling hills, her little gray cells at rest but ever ready. Thornfield Grange, like St. Mary Mead, was a microcosm of human nature, flawed, complex, and capable of both great harm and great healing. With a quiet sigh, she settled back, content to return to her village, where new stories, new secrets, and new puzzles undoubtedly awaited.